I never expected a single moment to change everything. Dr. Renard wasn't just a professor. He was captivating, a force I couldn't ignore. Every glance, every word, pulled me closer to something I didn't understand but couldn't resist. That night in his office, when his hand brushed mine, everything shifted. The kiss we shared wasn't just a crossing of boundaries. It was an awakening, a step into the unknown. This is my story of connection, risk, and the unspoken truths that shape us. Would I take that step again? I'm not sure, but I'll never forget the way it felt. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. My name is Lien. At 17, I'm not just the youngest student in the university's geography program. I'm the youngest person in any room I step into here. I thought that being ahead of the curve would feel rewarding, but more often than not, it's isolating. My peers are older, more self-assured, and carry an air of maturity that I can't quite match. Still, geography has always been my anchor. I've been fascinated by maps and landscapes for as long as I can remember. For me, the world isn't just a collection of places. It's a vast, interconnected web of relationships between land, people, and time. That passion has been my solace, my guide, and, more recently, my ticket into a world I don't always feel ready for. And then there's Dr. Renard. The first time I saw him, I wasn't sure what to expect. Professors here are all renowned in their fields, but Dr. Renard was something else entirely. When he entered the lecture hall on the first day of term, the air shifted. He didn't need to call for attention. It settled on him naturally. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably composed. His graying hair and sharp features gave him an air of authority, but it was his voice that truly captivated the room. It was deep, rich, and deliberate, each word chosen as if it carried the weight of discovery. Geography, he began, pacing the room slowly, is not about memorizing maps. It's about understanding the forces that shape our world and, in turn, ourselves. I was hooked. Dr. Renard didn't just teach. He guided you through stories of tectonic shifts, ancient trade routes, and forgotten explorers. His lectures made the Earth feel alive, as though its history was unfolding in real time before us. For the first few weeks, I focused entirely on the material. I took copious notes, stayed late in the library to keep up, and made sure to sit where I wouldn't draw attention to myself. But I couldn't help noticing him. It was in the details, the way his hands gestured as he spoke, the way he always made eye contact when answering a question. He had a way of making you feel seen, as if his words were meant just for you. And sometimes I felt like they were. I catch him looking at me during lectures. Not often, but enough that it stood out. It wasn't the casual glance of a professor surveying the room. It was something more deliberate, more curious. The first time it happened, I convinced myself I was imagining it, but it kept happening. And each time, I felt a strange mix of nervousness and something else. One afternoon, as he dismissed the class, his voice broke through my thoughts. "Lien," he said, his tone steady but inviting. "Could you stay for a moment?" My heart raced as the room emptied around me. I gathered my notebook and walked to the front of the hall, feeling acutely aware of how small I seemed in the space. "You have a keen mind," he said, folding his arms and leaning slightly against the desk. "Your questions in class are thoughtful. I can see you're passionate about this subject." "Thank you," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, a small, measured expression that felt both encouraging and probing. "What do you hope to do with your studies? Where do you see yourself in the next few years?" The question caught me off guard. Most professors didn't ask things like that. Not in a way that felt personal, anyway. I haven't thought that far ahead yet," I admitted. "That's understandable," he said. "At your age, you're still discovering the world and yourself. But I think you have potential, Lien. More than you might realize." His words lingered in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. There was something in his tone, in the way he said my name, that felt different. Not unkind, but weighted. "Thank you," I said again, clutching my notebook tighter. He nodded, the moment passing as quickly as it had come. Well, keep up the good work. I'll see you in the next lecture. I left the hall with my mind racing. Had I imagined the subtle shift in his tone? The way his gaze seemed to linger just a second too long? Or was I overanalyzing? As I walked across the campus, the autumn air crisp against my skin, I replayed the conversation in my head. Dr. Renard's words echoed like a riddle I couldn't solve, leaving me with a mix of admiration, confusion, and something else I didn't yet have a name for. That was the first time he spoke to me directly, and it wouldn't be the last. I couldn't shake the feeling of being singled out. Dr. Renard's words from the last lecture replayed in my head on a loop. You have potential, Lien. More than you might realize. Potential for what? His voice had been steady, his gaze unwavering. Yet there was a nuance to his tone that made my stomach twist every time I thought about it. The next lecture came and went uneventfully. I made a point of sitting toward the middle of the hall this time, hoping to avoid catching his eye. Despite my efforts, I couldn't help glancing toward him occasionally, wondering if he would call on me again. He didn't, but when the lecture ended and the rest of the class began packing their things, I heard his voice cut through the rustle of papers and low murmurs. Lien, could I have a word? My chest tightened. I pretended not to notice the curious glances from a few of my classmates as I made my way to the front. Dr. Renard was already seated at his desk, a few papers spread before him. He gestured for me to take the seat across from him. How are you finding the course so far? He asked, leaning back in his chair. It's fascinating, I replied honestly. Your lectures make everything feel alive. He smiled faintly. That's the goal. Geography isn't just about facts and figures. It's about the connections between people and the land they inhabit. You seem to grasp that naturally. Thank you, I murmured, unsure where this conversation was headed. He reached for a folder on his desk and slid it toward me. I've compiled a few articles I think you'll find interesting. They're a bit more advanced than what we cover in class, but I think you're ready for them. I stared at the folder, my fingers brushing the edge of it tentatively. Why me? His gaze held mine for a moment, steady and unreadable. Because I see potential in you, Lien. You remind me of myself when I was your age. Curious, eager to explore beyond the surface. The compliment landed heavier than I expected, sending a ripple of warmth through my chest. I'll read them, I said, clutching the folder as though it held more than just articles. He nodded, his expression softening slightly. Good. I'd like to hear your thoughts next week. And if you have questions, my office door is always open. I stood, uncertain of how to end the conversation. Thank you, Dr. Renard. He smiled again, and this time it felt more personal. Call me Renard, when it's just us. Formalities aren't always necessary. That caught me off guard. I hesitated, then nodded before making my way out of the lecture hall, the folder clutched tightly to my chest. The cool air outside hit my face as I stepped onto the campus grounds. I found a bench nearby and opened the folder, skimming the first article. It was dense, packed with terminology and concepts I hadn't encountered before. Still, I could see why he'd chosen it. It challenged me, beckoning me to push beyond my comfort zone. But it wasn't just the content that occupied my thoughts that evening. It was him, the way he spoke, the way his eyes lingered, the quiet authority in his voice. I told myself it was just admiration, nothing more. Yet, as I walked back to my dorm, the folder tucked under my arm, I couldn't help wondering if there was something else there, something I wasn't ready to name. The folder became my obsession over the weekend. The articles inside were a challenge, denser than anything we'd studied in class. One piece on tectonic plate theories stretched my understanding to its limits, while another on the impact of early trade routes on cultural geography made me rethink everything I thought I knew about human migration. I wanted to impress Dr. Renard, as he'd told me to call him. That thought stayed with me as I pored over the material, highlighting passages and scribbling notes in the margins. But my focus wasn't purely academic. The way he'd spoken to me during our last conversation lingered in my mind. "You remind me of myself when I was your age." There had been warmth in his voice, but something else, too. Something that sent a shiver through me whenever I replayed it in my head. By Monday, I had devoured every article and filled several pages in my notebook with questions and observations. I felt a mix of pride and nervous anticipation when I walked into his lecture. This time, I couldn't pretend to blend into the crowd. Renard's eyes found mine almost immediately, and I felt my pulse quicken under his steady gaze. The lecture passed in a blur of note-taking and occasional stolen glances. At the end, as students began filing out, I stayed in my seat, waiting to see if he would say something. He didn't disappoint. "Lien," he called, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Can I see you for a moment?" My heart thudded as I approached the front of the hall. Renard was already gathering his papers, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Did you have a chance to look over the articles?" he asked, glancing at me as he slid a stack of papers into his bag. "Yes," I said quickly. "They were incredible. I mean, some of them were difficult, but I think I understood most of it." He smiled, a faint curve of his lips that felt almost indulgent. "Good. I'd like to hear your thoughts in more detail. Are you free this Thursday afternoon?" "Thursday," I repeated, caught off guard. "I'd like to discuss your observations in my office. Say 3 o'clock. The way he phrased it made it sound like a suggestion, but his tone left no room for refusal. I nodded. "I'll be there." "Excellent." He handed me a slip of paper with his office number written in neat, precise handwriting. "Bring your notes." I left the hall clutching the paper, a strange mix of excitement and unease swirling in my chest. The days leading up to Thursday felt agonizingly slow. I found myself second-guessing everything: what I would say, how I would act, even what I would wear. I told myself it was just a meeting, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. When the day finally arrived, I stood outside his office door, my hand hovering over the nameplate that read, Dr. Julian Renard. The weight of the folder in my bag felt heavier than usual, as if it carried all my doubts and questions along with the articles. I took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," his voice called from inside. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the room and felt immediately overwhelmed. Renard's office was nothing like I had imagined. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines worn and faded with age. A globe sat on a side table, its surface etched with hand-drawn lines and annotations. The room smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, a comforting yet intimidating mix. Renard was seated behind his desk, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he studied a document. When he looked up, his expression softened, and he gestured for me to sit in the leather armchair across from him. "Thank you for coming, Lien," he said, setting the paper aside. "Thank you for inviting me," I replied, my voice wavering slightly. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning my face as if he were trying to read my thoughts. "I'm glad to see you've taken this seriously. Not many students your age would approach this kind of material with such dedication." "I enjoyed it," I said honestly. "It made me think about things differently, about how geography isn't just about places but about connections, about people and their stories." His lips quirked into a small smile. "Exactly. That's the essence of geography. It's a way of seeing the world that most people never grasp." The conversation flowed more easily after that. We discussed the articles, my questions, and even a few of my own theories. Renard listened intently, occasionally nodding or interjecting with a point that made me see things in a new light. By the time I left his office, the unease I'd felt earlier had shifted into something else, something I couldn't quite define but was certain would stay with me for a long time. By the time I reached Dr. Renard's office door, my heart was pounding hard enough to drown out the sounds of the bustling hallway behind me. I wasn't sure if it was the anticipation of the conversation or the atmosphere Renard carried like a shadow that unnerved me more. His door was ajar, a small sliver of golden light spilling into the hallway. I knocked lightly, "Come in," his voice called out, low and steady. The office was dimly lit, the warm glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows over the rows of bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. It smelled of aged paper, polished wood, and faintly of coffee. Renard sat at his desk, reading a book, his glasses resting on the tip of his nose. He looked up, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Lien," he said, setting the book aside. "Come in. Have a seat." I stepped inside, feeling the door click shut behind me. The room felt intimate, almost too quiet. I took a seat in the leather armchair across from his desk, my bag still slung over my shoulder. "Did you have a chance to reflect on our last discussion?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. I nodded, pulling my notebook from my bag. I went through the articles. I made notes, and I came up with a few questions. He smiled, resting his elbows on the desk. "Let's hear them." As I began explaining my thoughts, Renard listened intently, his eyes fixed on me. His attention was unflinching, almost disarming, as if I were the only thing that mattered in that moment. I stumbled once or twice, fumbling over my words under the weight of his gaze, but he never interrupted. When I finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "You've done well, Lien. Your insights are sharp, and your questions show a level of curiosity I rarely see." "Thank you," I murmured, feeling a flicker of pride beneath my nerves. He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the desk. "You know, most students your age don't approach these kinds of topics with such depth. It's clear you're not like most people." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I started to respond, but my voice faltered. Renard tilted his head, studying me. "Do you know why I invited you here, Lien? To discuss the articles?" I replied, though the answer felt incomplete as I said it. "Partly," he admitted, his voice soft but measured, "but also because I see something in you, a curiosity, a potential that I think deserves to be nurtured." My throat felt dry. There was a weight to his words, an unspoken layer beneath them that I couldn't quite name. "You have a way of seeing the world," he continued. "That's rare for someone so young. I noticed it from the first time you spoke in class." I looked down at my hands, feeling the heat rise to my face. I want to understand things better, to see the connections that other people don't. "And that's why I want to help you," he said, his voice dipping lower. "You remind me of myself when I was your age." There it was again, that phrase, delivered with the same gravity as before. I glanced up at him, unsure of what to say. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Renard's gaze held mine, steady and unflinching. "Do you feel it too?" he asked suddenly. "Feel what?" I replied, though my heart knew exactly what he meant. "The understanding between us," he said, choosing his words carefully. "It's rare to find someone who sees the world the way you do, who feels the same pull toward something greater." My pulse quickened, and for a moment, I couldn't find my voice. I don't know," I stammered. "Maybe," Renard nodded, leaning back in his chair. He didn't push further, but the way he looked at me made it clear the conversation wasn't over. "Lien," he said finally, "whatever you're feeling, it's okay. This kind of connection, it's not something to fear." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I wanted to believe him, to trust the sincerity in his voice. But the intensity of the moment was overwhelming. "I think I should go," I said, standing abruptly. Renard didn't stop me. Instead, he nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Of course. Take your time. My door is always open." I grabbed my bag and left without another word, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and doubt. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I couldn't stop replaying his words in my head. There had been no judgment in his tone, no pressure. Yet, the weight of the unspoken lingered heavily on my chest. What had just happened? After that meeting, nothing felt the same. I told myself I'd imagined the subtle intensity in Renard's voice, the way his eyes lingered on mine just a second too long. It was easier to believe I was overthinking than to confront the possibility of something deeper, something unspoken and unsettling. But when I walked into his next lecture, all those reassurances unraveled. Renard was the same as always, poised, confident, and commanding. Yet, every time he glanced my way, I felt it. His gaze wasn't casual. It was searching, as if he was waiting for me to acknowledge what had passed between us in his office. My cheeks burned, and I kept my head down, pretending to take notes. It didn't help. "Excellent point, Lien," he said during one of his explanations, singling me out in front of the entire class. His voice was calm, but the weight of his words felt heavier than they should have. "Thank you," I mumbled, barely looking up. The rest of the lecture dragged on in a haze of stolen glances and self-conscious fidgeting. By the time it was over, I practically bolted for the door. "Lien," Renard called out before I could escape. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" I froze, my stomach knotting. Turning slowly, I saw him standing by the lectern, his expression unreadable. "Sure," I said, my voice barely audible. The hall emptied around us, leaving just the two of us standing in the cavernous silence. He approached me slowly, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his tone measured but sincere. "Apologize," I repeated, confused. "For making you uncomfortable in our last meeting," he clarified. "It wasn't my intention to overstep any boundaries." I stared at him, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to let him off the hook, to say it was fine, that I'd been overreacting. But another part, the part that couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me, wanted answers. "It's okay," I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. I wasn't sure what to think." "That's fair," he replied, his eyes softening. "I only meant to encourage you, to help you see the potential I see in you. But if I've made you uncomfortable, I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." There was something in his voice, a note of regret, perhaps, that made my chest tighten. "You didn't make me uncomfortable," I said quickly. "Not exactly. I don't know how to explain it." Renard studied me for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You don't have to explain, Lien. I understand." The way he said it made me wonder if he truly did. "Thanks," I murmured, unsure of what else to say. He nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "If you ever want to talk, or if you have any questions about the material, you know where to find me, right?" I said, clutching my bag tighter. "I'll keep that in mind." As I left the hall, I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. He'd apologized, promised to respect my boundaries, yet the tension between us still lingered, unspoken and unresolved. A few days later, I found something unexpected waiting for me in the campus mailroom. A package addressed in Renard's neat, precise handwriting. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it right there. Inside was a book, its title embossed in gold on the cover, Navigating Social Boundaries, Explorations of the Unspoken. A note was tucked inside the front cover, written in Renard's familiar script. "Lien, I thought this might interest you. It's an insightful exploration of the spaces we often hesitate to cross. I'd love to hear your thoughts when you're ready. Renard." My stomach flipped as I read the note. Was this just an academic gesture? Or was there something more behind it? I carried the book back to my dorm, my hands trembling slightly. That night, I stayed up late, flipping through its pages. The author spoke about the invisible lines that exist between people, the unspoken rules that govern relationships, and the courage it takes to challenge them. Every word felt like it was meant for me. By the time I closed the book, the sun was rising, and my mind was racing. Renard's words, his note, the way he'd spoken to me, it all swirled together in a confusing, intoxicating mix. I didn't know what to think, but one thing was certain. I couldn't stop thinking about him. The book sat on my desk for days, its presence impossible to ignore. Every time I glanced at it, Renard's note echoed in my mind. "I'd love to hear your thoughts when you're ready." Was I ready? That question gnawed at me relentlessly, consuming my thoughts during lectures, meals, and even late at night when I should have been sleeping. I tried to convince myself it was just a book, just an academic gesture. But deep down, I knew better. On Thursday evening, after hours of restless pacing, I made a decision. Grabbing my bag, I slipped the book inside and left my dorm. The air outside was crisp, the campus quiet under the dim glow of streetlights. I made my way to Renard's office, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached his door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the nameplate, the polished brass glinting faintly in the light. I could still turn back, I thought. I could pretend I'd never gotten the note, never read the book. But something inside me refused to let go of the questions that had been building since our first conversation. I knocked. "Come in," his voice called, steady and calm. The office looked the same as before, warm, inviting, and intimate. Renard sat at his desk, his glasses perched on his nose as he scanned a sheet of paper. He looked up as I entered, a hint of surprise crossing his features before it was replaced with his usual composure. "Lien," he said, setting the paper aside. "I wasn't expecting you."
He faltered.
Suddenly unsure of how to begin. My hand tightened around the strap of my bag. "I wanted to talk about the book." His expression softened, and he gestured toward the armchair across from his desk. "Have a seat." I lowered myself into the chair, pulling the book from my bag and placing it on the desk between us. "It was different," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've never read anything like it." Renard nodded, leaning back in his chair. "What stood out to you?" I hesitated, my fingers brushing the edge of the book. "The part about boundaries, about how some of them aren't as clear as we think, how they're negotiable." He studied me for a moment, his gaze calm but searching. "And what did you think of that idea?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It made me think about things differently, about people and connections and what's right or wrong." "Those are difficult questions," he said, his voice low. "But they're important ones, especially for someone like you." "Someone like me?" I asked, my chest tightening. "Someone who sees the world differently," he said simply. "You're not afraid to question things, to explore ideas that others might shy away from. That's rare, Lien. And valuable." His words sent a shiver through me, and I looked down at my hands, unsure of how to respond. "Lien," he said softly, drawing my gaze back to him. "Why did you really come here tonight?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. My throat felt dry, and for a moment, I couldn't find my voice. "I don't know," I said finally, though it wasn't entirely true. Renard leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "I think you do." My pulse quickened, and I felt the air in the room grow heavier, the silence between us charged with something I couldn't name. I began, my voice barely audible. "I needed to know what all of this means. The book, the note, the way you look at me." Renard's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to soften. "And what do you think it means?" I shook my head, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know. I can't tell if I'm imagining things, or if there's something here," he finished, his voice quiet but steady. I looked up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt impossibly small, the space between us shrinking with every passing second. "Yes," I said finally. Renard exhaled softly, his expression unreadable. "Lien, this isn't easy for me to say, but from the moment you walked into my class, I felt drawn to you. Your curiosity, your perspective, the way you see the world. It's unlike anything I've encountered before." His words hit me like a wave, and I struggled to process them. "But you're my professor," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "And I've tried to keep my distance, to ignore what I was feeling. But it's been difficult." I didn't know what to say. My mind raced, torn between the weight of his confession and the truth of my own feelings. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Renard reached across the desk, his hand stopping just short of mine. You don't have to decide anything right now, Lien. But I need you to know that whatever this is, it's not something I take lightly. The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten. I looked down at his hand, so close yet so distant, and felt a surge of emotion I couldn't name. Without thinking, I reached out, my fingers brushing his. The contact was brief, but it felt electric, like crossing an invisible line I hadn't even realized was there. When I looked up at him, his gaze held mine, and in that moment, the world seemed to fall away. Lien, he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. I leaned forward, my heart pounding, and before I could second-guess myself, I closed the distance between us. Our lips met in a kiss that was tentative at first, then deepened as the unspoken tension between us finally broke. It wasn't hurried or careless. It was deliberate, an unspoken promise exchanged in the quiet of his office. When we finally pulled apart, Renard rested his forehead against mine, his voice barely audible. You're not just another student to me, Lien. You never were. His words left me breathless, and for the first time, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Whatever lay ahead, I knew one thing. I wasn't alone in this. The next morning, everything felt different. As I walked across campus, the world seemed both sharper and softer at the same time. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint smell of damp leaves, and the sounds of students chatting and rushing to classes felt distant, as though I were moving through a dream. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in Renard's office, the way his voice had trembled with quiet sincerity, the warmth of his hand brushing mine, the intensity of the kiss that had shifted something deep inside me. I'd crossed a line I never thought I'd approach, let alone step over. And yet, instead of regret or fear, all I felt was a strange kind of calm, as though I'd finally found a place I didn't need to explain. Later that day, I found myself sitting on a bench outside the library, the book Renard had given me resting on my lap. I opened it to the note he'd left inside, reading his words again, explorations of the unspoken. That was exactly what this was, an exploration of something undefined, uncertain, and utterly new. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from Renard. I hope you're feeling okay today. If you'd like, my office is open this evening. I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. I'll stop by after my last class. The hours that followed passed in a haze of lectures and half-hearted note-taking. By the time I reached Renard's office that evening, the campus was bathed in the soft amber light of sunset. His door was slightly ajar, and I knocked gently before stepping inside. Lien, he said, standing from his desk. His voice carried the same calm authority as always, but there was a softness to his expression that hadn't been there before. Hi, I said, closing the door behind me. For a moment we stood there in silence, the weight of the previous night hanging between us. How are you feeling? He asked finally, his tone careful. Okay, I said, managing a small smile. I've been thinking a lot. So have I. He admitted, gesturing for me to sit. I sank into the familiar leather armchair as he took his usual place behind the desk. This isn't something I take lightly, he began, folding his hands in front of him. What happened last night? It wasn't planned, but it wasn't a mistake, either. I nodded, my chest tightening. I don't think it was a mistake. Renard's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly. I want to be clear about something, Lien. This isn't just about a moment of impulse. I care about you more than I should, perhaps, but I care deeply. And I need you to know that I'll respect whatever you decide from here. His words sent a rush of warmth through me, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. I care about you too, I said quietly. I don't know what this is, or where it's going, but I want to find out. Renard smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that made the tension in the room dissolve. Then we'll take it one step at a time, he said. There's no rush. As the evening stretched on, we talked about geography, about life, and about the strange, uncharted territory we were stepping into together. When I finally left his office, the sky was dark, the campus quiet except for the distant hum of crickets. I walked slowly, my thoughts clear for the first time in weeks. Whatever lay ahead, I knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time I felt ready to face it.